just to remind everyone that we are recording this session, and that the etiquette for this is to please keep yourself on mute. We've got a presentation and then a panel. There'll be some Q&A time for the session as well. The focus of this month's drop-in follows on from our session that we had about 6 or 7 weeks ago on addressing sexualised violence in the work, like how does it show up, how are we responding to it, and we had a panel discussion at that session as well with Karen Willis, and Sal Dennis joined us and gave a bit of insight into the work of Insight Exchange, My Dignity, and Alina, who's one of our policy research officers, also gave us an update on some research that she'd been undertaking here at No to Violence. So it was really clear from the interest in that session that we've wanted to really sort of raise these conversations up and start having them with you all. So it's been really great that so many people are keen to come on board and start looking at this session. We're going to address pornography. How does it show up in the work with men, and what are their current or former partners saying? So I'd want to remind everyone, excuse me, that this topic and many of our sessions are can be really triggering. So please take care of yourselves. If you need to leave the session, take your headphones off, turn your camera off. Please, do whatever you need to do to look after yourself. If you feel after the session that things have been raised for you, then I really encourage you to seek some support, have a chat to somebody, reach out to your EAP, your counsellors, your supervisor, whatever you need to do. I think it's important that we acknowledge that, just because we do the work doesn't mean to say we're not, really impacted by the work as well. So I want to really acknowledge our colleagues that have come today to be part of this session. So Dr. Michael Flood is with us. I'm going to do a bit more of an intro to him in a little while. And on the panel, we've got Marie Yorston from RAV. We've got Kyalie Moore from No to Violence. We've got Luke Addinsall from the Men and Family Centre, and Steve Booth from Relationships Australia Victoria as well. And so all of those people are going to introduce themselves a little bit more, or I'm going to introduce some of them. But the topic, we met on Friday to kind of brainstorm this topic a bit and come up with some questions. And really the session is focusing on porn. What are the contents of porn and its impacts? How porn can shape and play out in intimate partner violence and control? Pornography and sexuality in the work, focusing on the problems. It's not talked about, and we're going to cover that for sure, particularly in the panel session. Addressing issues of porn and sexuality, sexualised violence in our work with men, and really importantly, addressing issues of porn, sexuality, sexualised violence in our work with victim survivors. I just, before I hand over to introduce Michael and hand over to Michael to do a presentation for us, I just want to note that we've had a little bit of feedback, and we're interested in having ongoing conversations around the term that we've been using on sexualised violence. And as I indicated in the previous session that we had, some of that influence has come from the work of Dr. Alan Wade and Linda Coates, and the work that they've been doing with Sal Dennis. And I know that, Sal and I have been having many conversations about this around how do we shift the language to recognise that we're not talking about sex, we're talking about violence. We're talking about violence that's been sexualised. So we're really happy to have conversations with anyone. And if you have some wonderings about the terminology or even some concerns about it, please reach out to myself or Kyalie. Raise a question at the end if you want to, and if we can, we'll address it. So just want to kind of put that out there, that we're really open to having these conversations around language. I'm going to introduce Michael now, and Michael's going to do a presentation to us on pornography, 10 points in 10 minutes, maybe slightly longer. So many of you will be familiar with Dr. Michael's work. He's an associate professor at the University of the Queensland University of Technology. His research focuses on gender, sexuality, and interpersonal violence, and more recently, it's been focused on interpersonal violence and its prevention, particularly in reference to men and masculinities. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work, and certainly what a wonderful speaker he is on this topic. Handing over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Lizette. So in the interest of time, I will get straight into it. And I'll start with some basic scene setting. So what is pornography? We can define pornography simply as sexually explicit media that are intended to sexually arouse the audience. So pictures of bodies, of sex that are intended to arouse. So this is a neutral definition, not a normative, not an ethical definition, although I'm definitely critical of pornography, as you'll see in a moment. So let's look at pornography's users, its content, and its impacts. Look at its users. Most everyday users of pornography are heterosexual men, and most of the commercial mainstream pornography industry caters to heterosexual men. And in fact, there's a very significant gender gap in the use of pornography. Pornography use is very common among young men in Australia. So young men in Australia aged 15 to 29, for example, 84% watch pornography weekly or daily. 47%, half of young men 15 to 29 watch pornography daily. 74% do so weekly. And there's a sense in which pornography really is becoming the cornerstone or the foundation of many boys' and men's sexualities. What about its content? So pictures of bodies, pictures of sex, as I said. But contemporary pornography routinely includes violent, hostile, and sexist content. And we know this from some big studies. So a study of the 50 top-selling porn titles in the US found high levels of violence. It found that 88% of scenes showed physical aggression, 48% of scenes showed verbal aggression, and that violence was largely by males and overwhelmingly against females. Another more recent study looked at 4,000 scenes, 4,000 heterosexual sex scenes from the two biggest porn sites, Pornhub and I think Xvideo, and it found that a third to a half of scenes included at least one act of physical aggression: spanking, gagging, slapping, hair pulling, and strangulation. And women were the targets in 97% of those incidents. So what we're talking about in pornography, in much pornography at least, is the sexual dominance of willing women, of women shown consenting to and enjoying aggressive and dominating forms of sex. A broader thing to say is we live in a culture that is increasingly pornographied, increasingly pornified, where pornography use is increasingly normalized and the boundaries between pornography and other forms of mainstream culture are increasingly blurry. So let's talk now about effects. Now, there's a massive body of research on the effects of pornography, and I'm going to summarize it in about 3 minutes. Pornography has 6 identifiable effects. First of all, pornography acts as sex education, and utterly unsurprisingly, young people who use pornography, for example, tend to know more about sex, more about bodies, and tend to have more liberal sexual attitudes than other people. Second, pornography functions as sex education in a second way. Pornography can shift its users' sexual interests, their behaviours, and their relations. The best example of that is that young men who use pornography are more likely than other young men to be interested in anal sex and to practice anal sex. And there's no problem with anal sex. The problems come more in terms of how it's practiced or how it's expected. Studies also find links between pornography use and rough sex and unsafe sex and various other things. And what's going on here is that pornography is shaping people's sexual scripts. It's shaping people's sexual scripts, what people think is normal and desirable in sex. It's providing a model of behaviour and guiding their expectations. Third, pornography can function as a relationship stressor. We know that in general, pornography lowers relationship satisfaction, particularly for men actually, and men who use pornography are more likely than other men to have lower levels of relationship and sexual satisfaction. For some women, not all women, but for some women, their male partner's pornography use reduces their sense of intimacy. They feel a sense of self-objectification or bodily shame, or they feel coerced into sexual acts, and I'll come back to this. Fourth effect is to do with addiction. Now, while I'm wary of the term addiction, some men's and perhaps some women's pornography use is experienced as compulsive or damaging for those users. But look, it's really the last two forms of pornography's impact that I think we should be most concerned about. The first of those is pornography as sexist education. Pornography teaches sexist and sexually objectifying understandings of gender and sexuality. It shapes how boys, and to some extent girls, and how men, and to some extent women, see girls and women, see sex, see gender. And it shapes how girls and women, boys and men, see themselves. Finally, there's pornography as rape training. Now, I use that term, that's a blunt term, rape training, but there's very good evidence that pornography teaches and encourages sexually aggressive and violent supportive attitudes and behaviours. And there's three kinds of studies here that are important. First, there are correlational studies that look for links between people's porn use and their attitudes and behaviours. And there are literally hundreds of those studies and meta-analyses of them. They find links between using pornography and practicing sexual violence, and also between using pornography and being involved in various kinds of dominating practices like strangulation or deep gagging oral sex. Now, those studies can't show causality. They can't show which came first, but other studies can. Experimental studies, where you show people pornography and test for impact on attitudes, they show an increase in sexually violent attitudes, sexually violent behaviours. Finally, longitudinal studies, where you follow a group of people over time, collecting data on their porn use or non-use and their relationships to sexual violence, and find what factors shape later sexual violence. And what we find is that pornography predicts later sexually violent attitudes and behaviours. So, for example, a study among young people in the US, young people who used violent pornography were over 6 times as likely as other young people to engage in sexually aggressive behaviour in the years following. In another study among males, males' use of pornography predicted their more frequent sexual harassment perpetration 2 years later. Now, it's important to say the effects of pornography are complicated. They're neither inevitable, they're neither all-powerful nor inevitable. They're shaped by 4 factors. They're shaped by the viewer, what the viewer brings to their use. They're shaped by how they engage with the material. Do they find it arousing? Do they find it realistic? They're shaped by the content. What are they actually watching? And they're shaped by the wider context of its use. What I'm trying to say is that pornography is a risk factor, one risk factor for sexual violence perpetration. It interacts with other factors to predict men's perpetration of violence against women. And the risk of increasing that risk is much greater for some men than others. Men who already have hostile and distrustful attitudes towards women, men who get turned on by controlling and dominating women, they're more attracted to pornography showing aggression, showing violence, and it has a greater impact on them than on other men who are more resistant to those ideas. So finally, how is pornography related to domestic violence and intimate partner sexual violence? There's growing evidence of links between pornography use and domestic violence in general and intimate partner sexual violence in particular. And we know this in Australia, for example, from research by Laura Tarzia. Pornography can play out in men's perpetration of intimate partner sexual violence in 5 ways. And I'll run through these and then I'll stop. First, some men use pornography as a tool to manipulate or groom women or force women to have certain sorts of sex, to engage in sexual acts that those men want to engage in, that those women don't particularly want to engage in, or to increase their likelihood of engaging them. And so, for example, in Laura Tarzia's study, which was among women who'd experienced intimate partner sexual violence, some women reported that their partners wanted to try sexual acts they'd seen in porn that those women didn't like. In a New Zealand study, some women reported that pornography was part of a pattern of sexually coercive behaviour, where their partners were trying to shift their expectations, shift what they were willing to do, and make it more likely they would do particular sexual acts in ways that felt pressured or coerced for them. Second, some men use pornography as a kind of manual, a kind of guide or manual for carrying out abuse. And there's good evidence that pornography shapes some men's interest in particular violent sexual practices, such as strangulation, or what colloquially is called choking, such as bondage and discipline, and other forms of rough and aggressive sex. And again, some women in Laura Tarsia's study felt that their partner's porn use was kind of inspiring them or driving them to try more violent, more extreme sexual acts. Third, some men take or distribute sexual images without the woman's consent or against their will. It's what used to be called revenge pornography. That's not a very useful term. A much better term is image-based sexual abuse, and that can be part of men's coercive control of women. Fourth, some men show women pornography under threat or coercion. And in fact, the impacts of that pornography exposure are significant for women themselves. So women who've used pornography are more likely than other women to engage in sexual practices that they don't particularly like, such as anal sex. Now, of course, some women love anal sex, fine, but there's also a pattern of engaging in practices that they don't want. Some women exposed to pornography are more likely to take on a view of their role as servicing him, as kind of focusing on his pleasure and so on. Now, some women do also report positive outcomes from pornography use. The fact that pornography is normalised in our culture, is increasingly common in our culture, also means that it's harder for women to refuse when their partners want to involve pornography in their sex life, or harder to refuse to imitate pornography or to do sexual practices that are widely represented in pornography. More generally, last point, pornography can worsen, can intensify patriarchal inequalities in men's and women's relationships. So in Laura Tarsia's study and another research, some women describe their relationships as focused almost entirely on his pleasure, with their role as kind of servicing his demands, with a significant cost to their own emotional and sexual safety. Now, I wanted to say a couple of things about prevention, but how am I going for time? Lizette, am I out of time and need to stop? I'm happy to stop now. Or do I have
you're good. Keep going. We were
Okay.
a bit ahead of time, so you're okay.
Cool. So what can we do about this? What can we do about the harms of pornography use? Very briefly, there are 4 strategies that are of interest. Absolutely, our children and young people need comprehensive sexuality education. And that means when they do encounter pornography, they may be more likely to respond critically to it, and they're less likely to go looking to porn for information about sex and relationships. Second, there's pornography education. And recently with Marie Crabbe, I published a paper on how to do pornography education in schools, how to educate young people to respond more critically to porn. Third, there's addressing pornography in violence prevention efforts. Now, there's been relatively little attention to pornography in Australian violence prevention efforts, but that has been shifting recently. The third action plan included a commitment to a community initiative to address the harmful impacts of pornography, and Our Watch has produced a campaign to counter the impacts of pornography among young people, although it's hard to see whether government and ministerial approval will let that out into the world. Fourth, and I think controversially, we can talk perhaps about better and worse forms of pornography. People talk about an ethical pornography, and often they mean they're only its conditions of production. But I also think we can think about ethical pornography in terms of its content. Certainly, I think there is better and worse pornography. Pornography that shows aggression is clearly worse than pornography that shows obviously consenting forms of sex. I still think, though, that in a culture where we have sexism, we have sexual objectification, any type of pornography can feed into that. So I'm going to hand over to Lizette and the panel, and I think that I hope there'll be some really rich discussion of the ways that in your work with victims and survivors and with perpetrators, how we can address some of these issues, and particularly how pornography can feed into intimate partner sexual violence. Thanks. Thanks
so much, Michael. That was really fantastic, and I'm sure it's a food for thought for everybody. I know Michael has to leave to attend something else, but just before he does go, does anyone have a question or two for Michael? Please raise your hand and just remember to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. And I think, did I see Peter Lear? Is that what you were doing, raising your hand, Peter?
Yes, that was. Sorry.
That's okay.
In a particular way. Michael, yeah, very, very interesting. Thank you for all of that. But have you published anything on that?
Whoops. Yes, I have. So there's a recent paper with Marie Crabb, and I can send a link to it, that really summarises the
Great,
research
thank you.
on
Yeah.
pornography's effects. This talk I just gave, I'm going to send to NTV so that they can distribute it as they see fit. But if your interest is research, then write to me privately, and I can provide you with far more research than you'd want in terms of sort of documenting the kinds of dynamics and effects that I've described.
Okay, you may hear from me. Thank you.
Great. And just to remind everyone that we will be creating a practice bulletin from this, which will include Michael's presentation, some links to some of the research that he shared with us, and anything else that you want to share with us, Michael, we'll put onto that. A recording of this, as well as some of the notes that are taken from today, organised in a way that will be really useful for you. Do we have any more questions before Michael leaves and we move on to the panel?
I had a question.
Please go ahead.
Which was,
just identify yourself.
Oh,
Sorry.
it's Sarah.
Hi,
Sarah.
hello, Sarah.
So nervous because it's being videoed. But I guess I was thinking, we started the conversation talking about how we don't call sexual violence sex, and we're claiming back that that's actually not sex, that's sexual violence, and sex is something different. And I'm curious about whether there's any parallels in the space of pornography, because I guess in the communities and spaces I'm in, there's often some really positive use of pornography, and that might look like someone touching an orange in a sensual way and two women cuddled up in bed watching that. And I'm just really curious, when we call it pornography and we use it to encompass all of that, whether we're kind of allowing what we've heard about as degrading and violent and objectifying and having a power differential. And actually it's not, whether we're giving it too much permission to claim that word. And I guess because the definition you gave of pornography was something that's designed to sexually arouse. And I don't know, I'm just curious whether there's been conversations about whether we claim that word back for what is designed to sexually arouse, and everything else that contains all of these horrific things that perpetuate misogyny and sexual violence are called what they are. Thoughts?
Just before you answer, Michael, can I just add to that question and say, what is the role of erotica there then? Because that's, to me, what you're talking about, but I'm interested in your answer.
Look, certainly some people distinguish, as Lizette has flagged, between pornography and erotica. And erotica is the good stuff and pornography is the bad stuff, simplistically. Other people talk about, feminist pornography versus, say, sexist or patriarchal pornography. My definition was open-ended. And I do think that we absolutely should be looking at the images and representations of sex that eroticize consent and eroticize mutuality, in contrast to what I think much of mainstream pornography does. I have to say, and to be blunt here, I don't like I disagree with the argument for using the phrase sexualized violence over sexual violence. It reminds me of the feminist slogan from the 1980s that rape is about power, not sex. And there was a really key insight in that. It was meant to be a critique of the idea that men rape women because of some kind of uncontrollable, biologically driven desire. But what it missed, and why there's now some feminist critique of that slogan, is that it missed that rape can be about power through sex, and that indeed there's ways that men learn a rapist sexuality. So I disagree that we should draw hard and fast lines between violence and sex, because I think there's important ways in which sexual assault is about sex. It's about kind of patriarchal and dominating forms of sex, and there's clear ways that sexuality comes to be socially organised in ways that are dominating and patriarchal. And to me, it seems misleading and unhelpful to kind of want to bracket off sex and sexuality from those things, because part of how rape and sexual assault work is precisely through what men learn to find sexually arousing and what men and women learn to find erotic. So I think, this is off the top of my head, but I think there are risks in the move to say that sexual assault or intimate partner sexual violence is about violence, not sex. I think there are risks in that move.
Well, it's violence to someone's sexuality. So the women's sexuality is often present in that, yeah.
And I'm just going to thank you. And Phil, I'm aware you've had your hand up for a little while. If maybe you have a question, this will be the last question before we move on to the panel. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Zach. Phil from the Men and Family Centre in Lismore, Michael. At the very beginning, and I don't want to sound like I'm challenging you, I'm curious for an extension and an understanding of the question for me is about when you said that pornography is consenting women, women who give consent for these acts. And I was just curious if you can expand on that some more, or if you can tell us more about that, because I don't necessarily know that I see it that way.
So I wasn't saying that pornography as an industry involves that the women who participate in the pornography industry are necessarily consenting. I mean, there's a good documentation of the direct forms of coercion that some women and indeed men are subject to then be part of pornography, and the kind of broader cultural and economic forms of coercion that shape women's and perhaps men's participation in the industry. But I wasn't saying that. I was talking about the images themselves that are routine in pornography show women apparently consenting to things that may be physically harmful or may be coercive or degrading. And so what pornography, pornography doesn't explicitly show rape, if you like, much pornography doesn't, but what it does show is women apparently consenting to a whole lot of different forms of aggression. And I think that, that in some ways can be particularly damaging.
Yeah, thanks. That clears it up for me. I kind of hoped that was where you were heading, but just I wasn't quite certain. So thank you. The word apparently means a lot to me in that. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. And thanks, Michael. I'm sure if we get any more questions that arise out of the chats, we'll either send them through to you via email, or we'll have a conversation with you about that. But thanks so much for your presentation.
My pleasure.
And I think it's great if we continue to have ongoing conversations about language.
Thanks, folks. See you, everybody.
See you, Michael. Okay, I want to, we're going to see the rest of the panel with Ivy's great support here, highlighting the panel members as they come up. So we've got Marie, Luke, Steve, and Kylie coming onto the screen. And fantastic, so lovely to have you all here. We started to have a really great conversation on Friday and a shorter one earlier on today. I really want to thank you for being part of this discussion and being willing to kind of start to lead a conversation. When we were talking on Friday, I think it was Steve that said, this is the conversation that's never been had. So we thought that we would name this panel discussion, This Is What It Is. And so what I'm going to do to start with is, we've got a few questions, but I'm going to ask each of the panel members to just introduce yourself. Just tell us a little bit about your role, the organisation you sit in, the role you sit in, and a little bit of history about perhaps how you've come to find yourself putting your hand up and saying, yeah, I really want to be on that panel and have this conversation today. So I'm going to start with you, Kylie.
Thank you, Lizette. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Kyalie Moore, and I'm the National Sector Development Manager here at No to Violence. I am a Wadjuri Yamaji woman from Western Australia. I have a lot of experience in facilitating MBC programs, men's behaviour change programs, predominantly in First Nations communities and with First Nations men in a prison setting and in a community setting. Have experience supervising as well, domestic and family violence trainer, and capability training. I'm passionate about ending family and domestic violence in First Nations communities. That's an area, and that has become sort of like my lifelong work, working in that space, building capacity in First Nations communities. I'm also passionate about ending family and domestic violence across this nation as a whole, but my first love is stopping it in First Nations communities. Thank you.
Steve.
Mute, sorry. My name is Stephen, or Steve, if you want to call me Steve. I've worked in family violence, male family violence, for 15 years. I've worked as a group facilitator, a family violence practitioner, a case manager. My current role is Senior Advisor to the MBCP program at RAV Victoria, where I sit in the Practice Quality Evaluation Office. still running groups. I think I will until they have to wheel me into a group. That's my passion, is trying to invite men to look at their behaviour and change. I do this work because I believe that, education is the key to the way out of this. And I really wanted to be on this panel after doing one a couple of weeks ago, because I think that what's happening with young men in particular, and through my assessments that I do with young men, I see that they've been completely re-educated in their attitude towards women along sexual violence. So,
Thanks, Steve. Thanks very much. Marie.
Hello, I'm Marie Yorston and I'm working for Relationships Australia Victoria as a partner contact worker for men's behavioural change programs. I also work in the Family Safety Navigation program, which is working with women and men who are experiencing family violence while separating in the mediation process. I've been working in family violence for around 10 years now, so worked in refugees and crisis services before coming to Relationships Australia. This topic, I think, is fantastic in the sense that it's a layer of family violence that we haven't yet started talking about properly. So to be part of bringing it out in the open and actually using words and language that we can relate to and starting to actually say those words now, to hopefully that everyone else will continue on saying them as well in the discussion.
Thanks, Marie. And Luke.
Lizette. Hi, everyone. So Luke Addinsall, I'm the manager at the Men and Family Centre in Lismore and Tweed Heads up on the northern New South Wales, Bundjalung country. And I've been in men's behaviour change and domestic violence sort of area for about 10 years, running groups, but also prior to being the manager as the clinical specialist of the organisation. Really passionate about the work. And yeah, I'm particularly interested in this topic because we grappled with it as an organisation ourselves a little while ago. How do we incorporate it? How do we speak to it more overtly with the men? How do we address this sort of really big area in domestic violence, even though it's often given a really small area in programs and so on. So, and particularly because I've noticed, both personally as a worker, but also with some colleagues that, it's a difficult conversation for us to have and a difficult conversation for us to become, if you like, fluent or comfortable in ourselves and then to take into group and sort of have a level of comfort there in order to be able to address it in a way that's as effective as it can be with the men and their families. So I'm really interested in how we do these conversations in the best way possible and just get better at it as a sector.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luke. Okay, great panel we've got here today, and I'm going to just start by opening and asking you a question, Marie. How does pornography, consent, and the sexualised violence arising from porn sort of show up in the advocacy work? What are you kind of hearing from women, and in your experience of engaging with women and perhaps other family safety advocates? How are the different practitioners having these conversations with their clients?
Yeah, so I guess first of all is what's concerning is that the women that are talking about, the clients, women that are talking to me about pornography and consent and sexualised violence are normally ones that have experienced that the sexualised violence is the main impact of the family violence for them, which is concerning. But what concerns me even more is the fact that a lot of women aren't actually talking about it. So in my experience, they will, we sit down, we do an intake session and we do a risk assessment and we ask one question about, have you been raped or sexually abused? And the answer to that question and creating that safe space for women to talk about that is more than just that hour intake. And they've already talked about, the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, and now they've got to open up around the sexualised abuse. And I find that when we get to that stage, they don't want to go there And that could be of two sort of reasons. One, that they don't know how to. They've already made themselves vulnerable. Society, you know, we talk about physical abuse and still men are saying, well, I didn't hit her, so it's not. So that's one layer. Then we've got this other layer of trying to, you know, explain and show and examples of the cohesive control. And that's kind of where we're at now. And then there's this other layer of more personal, you know, more vulnerable area, you know, for women to come out and say, you know, I did these acts, but I actually didn't want to, you know. So we have to create a space there for women to actually talk about that. And then a discussion for them to have, well, was that, did I really want to? Often when I am talking to women, I will say, you know, did he ever rape you or sexually abuse you? And that means having sex when you didn't want to. And they go, oh yeah, I did that all the time. You know, so how can we expect them to answer a tick box question when we actually haven't sort of talked about what it is, you know? And then when you bring pornography into it, yeah, how can women be vulnerable and open up and talk about this when, yes, what we've got to compare our sexual life with is pornography? Because are we having those discussions around what's healthy, what's a healthy sex life? I think it is absolutely in practitioners and safety, family safety workers, that we are not having those conversations. Again, we've just started the cohesive, the physical abuse, and then down to how do we talk about the sexualized abuse. And it's not just talking about it, it's where to from there. You know, women aren't comfortable still talking with police officers and other professionals, that they don't want to then bring that out into them as, you know, to talk to them as well. You know, it's hard enough just to get someone to believe that, you know, the abuse was there and that it was real, and then for the woman to actually go, oh my God, yes it was, and then they go back through and they go, oh my God, it was throughout the relationship for 30 years, to then say, oh yeah, and, you know, so for the women that do open up and talk to me, they're happy to talk to me and do a bit of a conversation about it, but they don't want to then report it. They don't want to act on it.
I think, and that speaks a lot to, we know the huge percentages of women who don't report sexualized violence, whether it's in their intimate partner relationships or even from strangers or people that they may know, you know, less well. So, you know, you're talking about creating those opportunities for women to feel safe, and part of that is also around how we can have those conversations comfortably and more easily. Yeah,
absolutely. And if we can't talk about it, if we can't actually put names to it and words to it, and at a level, not a professional level, like everyone sounds really professional, but me, I'd prefer just to be, you know, did you get yourself drunk before he had sex with you? You know, does he sit there and masturbate? You know, but I'd probably actually say wank. What does he wank? Does he play with himself? You know, using real words to help people to be able to feel more comfortable in talking about it, because I think sometimes that's what you need to do to bridge that gap as well.
We had a bit of that conversation the other day, didn't we? And that's about our comfortability about talking around this. I'm just going to let everyone know as well that we've got some time at the end for your questions. So either write your question down or pop it in the chat, and we will come to questions and answers at the end of this session. Luke, I've got a question for you as well. Porn remains a pretty taboo subject for many men, particularly older men. And can you talk us through some of your experiences and observations? Are younger men more open to talking about their engagement with porn and with sex? And I think we heard through Michael's presentation that, you know, young men are, and it's a really big part of their sex education or their how they are seeing their sexuality sort of be developed and their experiences with others. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience of both doing one-to-one work and group work with men?
Yeah, I think it is still taboo, and like sort of broadly in a group context, I think there's still a reluctance to talk about it in general, let alone in terms of acknowledging you know, the perpetration of violent or forceful acts. So I think it's something that we've still got a fair bit of work to do. And what we do notice is, you know, in terms of our program, certainly when we're in the earlier stages, when we're talking about definitions of violence, we'll often there's columns that go up on the board. Lots of people will probably be familiar with that sort of exercise. And sexualised violence is often a column that stays fairly blank. It's not as filled in as some of the other columns, and it often requires a little bit more coaxing in terms of I guess drawing out information in that regard, and also potentially education in terms of sort of some of the ways that we might understand sexual violence that they might not be thinking of necessarily as guys who have come to the group. So I think certainly earlier on there's more reluctance, and as trust builds and there's a sort of there's a willingness to start acknowledging abuse and violence across the spectrum, then potentially it comes online a little bit more. But it's certainly, I would say, probably still the most reluctantly gone to place for a lot of the men who are in the programs. And I think it's really can be a tricky place, because I think we want to make sure that we're not you know, in sort of having the conversations, we want to be sex positive. We want to be really you know, we want to be sort of encouraging an open conversational style, and at the same time we obviously don't want to be condoning sexualized violence. So getting that balance as well, because trying to remove some of the taboo, but also, you know, make it really clear what our position is on in this area, I think is a really important sort of juggle particularly for facilitators, and is another reason as to why I think it's important that we've done our own work around this, so we can sit really comfortable and we can be really clear about where we are and where we're positioning ourselves within the conversation. As far as the younger guys go, I think it is a bit more normalised, and I think they've grown up in an environment, as Michael was saying, as you pointed out, that you know, really it's more normalised, and society is more sexualised. So there is more of it present for them. I think probably hardcore porn is something that they you know, they can sort of refer to as a common experience of sort of having seen, probably more so than the older guys who might, you know, probably have seen and potentially engaged in, but would perhaps be less likely to openly have a conversation about it, as though it is something of everybody's experience, like I think probably the younger guys are probably more likely to do. So I think it's the importance of building trust in groups, the importance of really outlining where I guess where we are in the content, and how we are travelling ourselves with the content, I think is really important. And as I say, the importance of sort of remaining sex positive whilst also sort of being really clear about consent and a whole bunch of other things, I'd say were probably the big ones for me at this point in time.
I know in some of the sessions, you know, over the years that I've sat in with the men, when we start talking about intimacy, and interestingly, a lot of the men will kind of do that thing, well, it's just about sex, isn't it? And for them, I sort of starting to identify the difference between closeness and intimacy that is sex, and then sex that is actually where perhaps your partner is not willingly engaging, or she's not feeling okay about what's happening, and it's all about getting what you want as a man. So those kind of really big conversations that can happen in that space.
Yeah, it feels important that we sort of lean into the conversation around sex rather than try. You know, I don't think, you know, hardcore porn's going anywhere, unfortunately, and so that conversation about filling the gaps and having conversations about intimacy and sex and you know, what is sex and what is consent and all of these sort of things. I think leaning in and sort of being more comfortable with it and expanding, whether it's childhood education or you know, adult programs, I think is really the way to go. Yeah, filling in the gaps, you know, like, and there's huge gaps because all they're getting is that really sort of often violent content, which is problematic.
We can come back to that one. I'm really interested in that, you know, in the sense that when I worked in as a youth and community development officer for 7 years in council, I did a lot of work with young people, and particularly young women's groups, and the number of, and this I'm going back 10 years or more now, but the number of young women who would come to me and talk about the experiences they were having with their boyfriends around having to do what actresses in pornography were doing, and how that was impacting their early experiences of their early sexual experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think certainly I've had similar conversations with young men who feel as though they need to perform that really sort of, violent masculine sort of version of the pornography sort of, masculine frame, if you like, when it feels so counterintuitive to the, I guess, the tenderness and unknowing sort of elements of sex that they're exploring as young people, and so there's this sort of sense where they go right outside of themselves to perform, often as well, particularly teenage boys. I think they're a bit lost at sea, and again, performing, very different, obviously, being on either end of that experience, as you say, but it's clearly having an impact on the way everyone's, a lot of young people are engaging.
Yeah, thank you. Kyalie, you want to unmute yourself? We're interested in some of your reflections of working with First Nations men and some of the work in community, and I know you've supported teams doing work with victim survivors as well. And the other day when we were talking, you talked about jealousing and the role that plays in community and how that's been influenced by porn. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Lizette. Listen, I think even before I sort of speak specifically to that, and with the focus in First Nations communities, traditionally, or in mainstream, we sort of look at victims and offenders when we're talking about domestic and family violence. So I just want to sort of shift from that lens, and as we sort of start to talk in First Nations communities, it's best looking at domestic and family violence and talking around communities and families as a whole, and that holistic approach. There's some work with that Hovain and Blaggs have done around addressing family and sexual violence in First Nations communities, and the holistic approach is better. There's different models, but as far as the jealousing stuff, that comes in the looking at the families as a whole, because you've got the couples, the intimate partner violence, where the sexual violence sits in that space as well, but there's other factors to consider within the families as a whole, such as, the humbugging, the jealousing, the lateral violence, and the couple fighting is all sits in that space in communities as a whole. And one of the preventative ways to addressing that in communities is through education. So we've got the community education as a whole, where we're talking about their law and culture, and as well as the intergenerational trauma. We know in First Nations communities that there's been a lot of sexual trauma within our communities with our young men and boys and our young women and girls. And so there's a lot of education that needs to take place in the communities as a whole. And that is how we address family and domestic violence in communities. We do it through a decoupling process, addressing family violence. So as well as working in the family and domestic violence space, linking into community health and well-being to address the family and domestic violence and sexual violence as well, through the knowledge that and the education that comes through addressing healthy relationships, addressing addictions, and so forth. So it's sort of a strategy type. So with our young men and boys, I was just thinking as Luke was talking. So with our young men and boys, and Dr. Flood also spoke about the ages of 15 to 29. Heterosexual men, 84% of those engage in pornography. It is not uncommon in First Nations communities that young men and boys will sit and watch pornography together. So there's that community, there's that community sense of, you know, condoning of sexual violence or condoning of sexual behaviours, and there's this confusion around intimacy and sex. You know, we're talking about impacts here, and those impacts do have a massive impact on community, because if we've got lots of young men and boys sitting and watching porn together, then their view of women is going to be like, they're just sex queens, man, and if they're not going to do for me what I've seen on this, then I'm going to up the ante and I'm going to add in some other bits and pieces like strangulation or things like that. So addressing family and sexual violence in communities needs to be done in a holistic approach for families. Also looking at that arousal and porn, you know, and the accessibility of porn. Once upon a time, the only way to access porn was through reading a magazine. Now, as technology is getting better, you know, I remember when I had teenage children in my home and the internet was becoming more and more popular, I got NannyNet, you know, to put those privacy and adult settings on the home computers. This is before our teenage children were able to have mobile phones and stuff, just to prevent that sort of stuff. But now it's just, you know, there's more and more things that are coming on. The accessibility is having a massive impact. You know, we've got young people in relationships sexting. So instead of once upon a time asking a woman to go out on a date, they're sending pictures of their private parts to as you know, to say, hey, you know, do you like what you see? You like what you see? You know, send me a picture. So they're doing all this sexting and grooming taking place within these relationships at quite a young age, as young as 12, 13. They're doing that stuff. So there's a lot of education that needs to take place in community, and that's one of the ways that we can address it within First Nations communities, as well as that law and culture, intergenerational trauma, and the healthy healthy relationships. You know, talking about healthy relationships, as well as the impact of porn and so forth in communities.
Thanks, Kylie. Thanks. I remember writing a paper some years ago at uni and doing it on pornography and doing some research, and some of the figures around people as young as 8 and 10 having access on their telephones and being able to watch it in the playground at school was pretty scary. So yeah, it's pretty rife, and we know that more and more children are being exposed to pornography. I'm going to move on to Steve now, and then we're going to kind of come back to a bit more of an open conversation. But Steve, if you'd like to unmute yourself. What are some of the beliefs that support coercive controlling behaviours relating to sex? I know that we were in our conversation the other day, you were talking to this. What is the role of porn here?
Firstly, let me say that all the previous speakers, everything they've said, I have absolutely seen in the assessment room with a man from a young age to an older age. So everything that's been said is absolutely spot on. I think the belief systems that underpin, before we get to porn, are always around male privilege and around entitlement. And I have no problem with the term sexualised violence, because if I can just draw one analogy first, we work on the principles of power and control and privilege and entitlement. Now, a man can get home from work and say, I want to read the stinking paper. And if he doesn't get that time, he can go into a violent episode and get that control. I don't see much difference in terms of the entitlement of wanting sex, demanding sex, and then using sexual violence to get that sex. I think the role of porn, what has happened is, particularly for young men, it's like my studies are always has been in social constructs, and how we are influenced by social constructs. Group behaviour is very, very important, and in particular to young men. And so men who watch porn are in a group. And so they readily succumb to it. They readily talk about the ideas. They readily want to be part of that. And so if you couple that with entitlement and male privilege, it becomes a very, very potent cocktail for the use of power and control to get what they see is genuinely their birthright. And what it also does, and I don't think older men escape from this, I think they have just learned how to talk to that in more secure groups. I still think that conversation is quite rife. As an older man, I've heard that through my life. And so there's no escaping it. It's not just, I think younger men are more ambivalent about it, and they use the conversation to in front of me as almost a power and control conversation. It's a shock value. Oh, they're into it. I'm into it. She likes choking. So they use the porn umbrella as not just normalisation, but that group matters because it's so big. And it's very hard for young men to publicly get out of that group because of the power of the big group. It's like all forms of patriarchy. You know, this group behaviour absolutely works for the idea. And so that's how I see porn influencing that. In the conversations I've had with men, you know, I just want to echo Marie's comments because there's a parallel behaviour with men in our checklist of sexual violence, which is very, very basic question. Have you made the person do something degrading? So it's an easy no, because they see rape or, you know, being dragged around by a collar or something like that as degrading. So I will then ask the question, okay, so what is your thoughts about degrading? Have the language. Is it forced anal sex? Is it golden showers? Start to use the language of the society because then they can focus in their head. If we keep on these taboo words and don't go there, they're not held accountable because we won't talk about it. And so I have many conversations with the partner contact worker to gain what is the language being used in the relationship? What is he able to hide because we aren't saying the words to him? You know, accountability is all about the language we use to get them to have the conflict in their own head about what's right and what's wrong. But if we collude with them and don't say, you know, so, okay, so she likes anal sex. Okay, how do you know? You know, don't ask, have you got consent? Because what is consent? What are the signals that are showing you? And I think porn, its role is to take all that away. It's a business machine that makes a lot of money and it hasn't got care of society in its eyes like most giant business machines. And so it's not going to go to those discussions. And I think that we have a massive risk, particularly for our young men and women, around what they are being normalised into. You know, I think for the older people here, you know, there's always been pornography. You can find pornography pictures in ancient Rome, but there was some form of, you know, it was always a put aside. I think it was Kyalie who just said now with the phones, with everything, we can't hide now our own heads and say, oh, it's the phone's fault. We are the governors of that. We are the people who need to speak. And I think that's our role about porn is to show that, look, okay, consent is utmost, but do you understand what consent is? So that's how all those views that come before this, I've seen it personified sitting in an assessment room where men just think it's part of life. But I think they use a lot of other coercive measures to get to that point of having sex. And what porn does, I think, is for people is if a woman doesn't subscribe to that view of women, she is somehow defective. And I think that's the oppression on young women today. And I've got 3 daughters, and it's very, very sad that the defense that they have to put up in their life to combat these conversations.
And the kind of put downs that happen when people do raise those concerns and say, I'm not comfortable with that, is usually you're prude, you're frigid, you're, you know, and they're quite severe terms to land, you know, on a young person or anybody. I'm wondering, you know, and everyone's picked up on this a little bit, but I'm interested in a conversation with all of you around how do we start to normalize these conversations with both the user of violence and the victim survivors who we're working with. As Steve has so kind of clearly pointed out, in all of our engagements, from those early intakes through to any case management one-to-one work or group work that we're doing, how do we actually start to normalize having that ability to kind of pull back the curtain, if you like, and say, you know, we're interested in having a conversation with you, taking into account that, particularly for victim survivors, you know, they're not going to tell you anything unless they feel safe and ready to tell. And there's a whole lot of reasons why. And I'll steer everyone when we get to the end towards the Inside Exchange My Dignity page, but there's some really great resources on that page around supporting victim survivors to talk about their experiences of sexualized violence. But I think it is something that we need to be able to normalize more so that those people who we're working with actually feel like they can lean into that space because we're leaning in and opening it up for them. Any ideas on what we need to do in order to facilitate that?
I'll just jump in. I've got so much to say. It's so hard to keep my mind focused on the one sort of area. But look, honestly, I think like what you were just saying, that it's victim survivors have to be comfortable enough to open up to you. However, they're not going to do that unless you ask the questions. And I often revert back when people are struggling to raise things. I often go back to how much better we are now with suicide. Are you okay? Are you going to, you know, do you have suicidal thoughts? Actually saying it and naming it. If they choose not to respond to the question at that time, that's okay. But if you don't put it out there, then they're not going to start to think about it. A lot of the time, you know, like I was sort of saying, that sort of tier Pandora's box, it's not open for victim survivors yet to really open up and discuss it. You know, we're only just starting to talk about cohesive control and understanding that and making that real. That we need to start talking now about the sexual abuse and the encounters and, you know, how women have resisted sexual, you know, resisted having sex with their husband of 20 years. You know, if we don't ask it, then they're not going to be comfortable. But if we start asking now, maybe in a few years' time, or hopefully next week, they will start talking about it and responding back. And, you know, it might not be on that intake that they open up. It might not be the second or third, but it might be the 5th conversation or phone call you have with them that they might say, oh, hey, do you remember how you asked me that? Can we talk a bit more about it? You know, we know family violence is about isolating women, you know, let alone having a healthy avenue of porn. I mean, of sex, a healthy view of what it is, or somewhere to go to, or healthy education around it. You know, they've only got him and what he's shown her for however long they've been in that relationship for. You know, so she's got no idea that porn is not okay, or some aspects of it is not okay. So, you know, as much as we talk about the negative, we also do need to have conversations around, you know, these healthy sex, and not just, you know, the intimacy and the romance, but the arousal. You know, when we talk about the act of sex, you know, what does turn us on, you know, and having those conversations. And when sometimes you have those conversations around what is healthy and positive, women can identify what's not. So
yeah, can I just jump in there on the flip side of that, Marie? The conversation with men at the very first contact that I always have now is around, because, you know, when we do sexual violence in a session, we do it over continuum, and so we put the continuum line up, and there's a sexist joke at the start, and there's rape and murder at the end, because a lot of men, they haven't got used to the terms, and they'll go, sexual assault, no, that's not me, that's down there, that's Harvey Weinstein or something like that now, the contemporary. But we bring it back to, okay, so what happens if your partner doesn't want sex? What are some things you might say? And if you invite that narrative, I might, sometimes I've joked, I've said, if you don't put out, I'm going to go down the road. What does that do? What is the implication of that in the other person's head? I suppose fear, lack of trust, and so they're the mechanics and the little cogs of coercion. And we have to get down to that really micro conversation, because themselves, I think deep down, they know the motivation, they know why it works. But when we get into the language of the micro, that's when the feeling hits. If you work with a little bit of shame there, and you can start to move them to guilt.
That's when you see something happening, isn't it, Steve, in the room?
You've got to go there. You've got to go there.
Yeah. So there's something about courage then, isn't there, on the for facilitators or for the practitioners in this work. There's something about us having the courage to go to those places that are out on the edge, those edgy places where we might feel really uncomfortable, but we need to lean into that edge if we're going to ask them to lean into that same edge. Yeah. And Luke or Kyalie?
I was just going to sort of add, yes, very, very important too, in particular in the group process, that you do have a male and female facilitator doing these sessions with the men. It's going to be very difficult, and it just isn't helpful if there's two men facilitating group having these conversations around sex, pornography and consent. The male and female facilitators spending enough time prior to group really planning, unpacking and addressing this content, because as soon as you step into that room, and Luke alluded to this previously, the men will pick up on your body, on the body language of the facilitators. So if the male facilitator or the female facilitator are not comfortable having these conversations, the men in the room will pick it up. And so having confident facilitators who have that trust and have got each other's back in that space as well, and been curious with the men around what does consent look like, what does, what is pornography, having those conversations. And in particular, one of the areas where I find that it's really important is around that make-up sex. Men really love talking about make-up sex and what that looks like. But is it really make-up sex? And really just unpacking that with the men and getting them to reflect and identify and really put their finger on their views and attitudes and beliefs around
what's really happening for them.
What's really happening for them.
Yeah.
And what's really happening for their partners.
And that's the privilege we get when we sit in these really intimate spaces with the men that we work with, and with the victim survivors that we work with, and supporting them as well. We're actually entering into a really intimate relationship, and in a sense, it's for us about taking up that permission to be, a lot more self-reflective ourselves, and see what we're bringing into that room. How are we meeting our clients, and what are we wanting, to open up, and what kind of conversations are we wanting to facilitate for everybody's learning, because we all learn something. I'm aware that I'm interested in going to the rest of the Zoom room for some questions, and I can see there's quite a bit of chat here. But I just want to, before I go over, is there any last thing that any of the panelists would like to say before I open it up to some questions? I think we've kind of covered the last three things that I had on my list. We've sort of managed to wrap all that up, the last few questions, so that's really great.
think one thing I do want to say, because I haven't actually verbally said it, is that with consent, I think it's very important that we talk about it. Like, consent is sort of that first time or a one-off sexual encounter with somebody, but whereas in a relationship, consent needs to be given at every act. You know, and I just think that we need to be saying that more so that people can understand that. That's all.
And I'd be interested in having our next session perhaps on this. We've already talked about our next national drop-in, and perhaps the flow on from this is kind of wrapping anything up from this session and the first session and talking some more about consent, because when we think about violence and abuse, it's actually crossing the lines of a consent, isn't it? So whether it's sexualized violence or a whole range of non-physical, coercively controlling violence or physical violence. So yeah, consent's a big one. Steve?
Yeah, just one quick thing. I just want to back up what Kyalie said. The use of co-facilitation across genders is the absolute underpinning principle of this work. I've worked in this work for 15 years and I will not co-facilitate with a man. I tried it once out of some sort of I think it was necessity. We couldn't, you know, the group must go ahead. It was like being in a football club room. The amount of collusion that was thrown at me was unbelievable, and I don't think even the most experienced practitioner can not avoid it, and it soon turns into an instructional teacher position, and it doesn't work. So I just wanted to back that up.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, I'm going to ask if anyone has got some questions, if you would like to raise your hand. It may be a little bit difficult for me to see because I don't have access to all the screen, but for those of you, so some of my co-hosts, if you see someone has got their hand raised, Peter, I can see you have a question.
Yeah.
And Bianca.
I want to preface my question with a comment. I think part of the difficulty perhaps in talking about sexualized violence and pornography with men and women is the fact that we don't really have a conversation about healthy sexuality, sex and intimacy within the general population, start with. So that's my preface, but my question is then, assuming that those subjects are important to talk about with victims and with men in a group or individually, where does this part of the conversation fit in? I mean, my thoughts are it's about masculinity, but I'm interested in what the group would think about their conversations about sexualized violence are absolutely important. But how do we balance those? How do we set contrasts for men who perhaps have never even considered different ways of expressing themselves sexually?
So I might just jump in first. That's a really great question, Peter, and I'll just jump in if you don't mind, and then anyone else can respond. The model of decoupling family violence strategies within the community health and wellbeing space is the place where I see that happening right across in mainstream and in First Nations communities. That's the way that we, in First Nations communities, we address it by having, you know, those conversations within the community health and wellbeing space around healthy relationships. Because often if we're talking about the healthy relationships and the healthy mental health and wellbeing space, doing the education in that space, that's where we can actually pick up any abnormalities within the relationship and then address the family and domestic violence and sexual violence that may be disclosed in those settings. And what you'll find in that healthy space when you're having those conversations around healthy relationships and mental health and wellbeing, in a hour consult with somebody, it's in the last 5 minutes after they've had those conversations around in the healthy space that they'll drop that bomb. And then you know, once that trust and that rapport has been built and established. Yeah. Anyone else would like to?
Oh, someone else from the panel before I go on to the next question. Anyone want to add to what Kylie and?
Yeah, I was just going to say, sort of along the same lines, you know, we talk about healthy relationships. We actually, that's relationships. We actually need to be talking about healthy sex, you know. So there's sort of two things. And I think obviously the school education system, we talk about safe sex and we talk about healthy relationships, but we also need to be able to talk about, you know, healthy sex, you know, as another wheel. Yeah.
Can I just add too? I think, you know, just on that in terms of healthy sex and getting quite expansive about that. You know, how bringing to the conversation a huge amount of sort of variety and nuance in terms of what is sex and what is healthy sex, and not necessarily. So, you know, if somebody's interested in something that is quite sort of I don't know what you'd call it, forceful, and both parties are consenting, and it's part of the sexual chemistry. Sometimes one of those parties might say, this is actually one of the most intimate things you can do for me because it's something that's really vulnerable for me to ask for, and by you, you know, so and so having conversations like that, bringing that to the fore, and then you know the example Steve gave before about, you know, saying something about going down the street. I think often, you know, those two sort of, if you like, things can be almost expected to be flipped around in terms of what's okay and what's not okay, and if we're starting to talk about healthy sex. And so supporting men to get this sort of understanding of the complexity of the topic and what is healthy, I think it's so, I mean, yeah, it's so crucial and complex.
Steve, you're out of, I'm going to go to Bianca's question. Bianca, you have a question.
Thanks, Lizette. I am a lawyer at Western Sydney Community Legal Centre, and I work with predominantly male perpetrators or victims of domestic violence and the legal issues that spur on from that. But the question I have is actually probably more personal, in the sense that I wanted to ask the panel, where would you suggest we go? What activities or groups we could potentially engage with that help get the word out to those in power who have more to do with pornography? For example, the campaign that was rolled out earlier this year in relation to consent, What with the Milkshake ad, was very, very frustrating, because we know that, as a lot of the panel members have said today, we can't prevent people from accessing pornography, but we know it's becoming more of a problem. And so we do need to get in and focus on educating, especially young people. But I know we talk about it in these particular settings where we see it every day, and we see how, I think as Steve said, how it can get, you know, to the very end of the line. What could we be doing as individuals or as organisations to, I suppose, get in earlier?
Panel. Thanks, Bianca.
Thanks.
Bianca, did you mean with politicians specifically, or just like talking school systems and that sort of thing?
I think anything. I suppose it's something to be raised with our MPs, but I know depending on whereabouts you live, a lot of our MPs, for example, in May this year, Liberal backbenchers were talking about restricting pornography for anyone under the age of 18. But if people as young as 8 years old are being able to access pornography, it seems frustrating to think that we want to try and prevent people from seeing it when we know they're going to see it. How can we be having those conversations with people who aren't in men's, that's right, who aren't in men's behavioural change programs yet?
Yeah, Steve.
Look, I think that anything these days that's brought up by a politician is a value proposition for their party. I don't think that either party has a credence like they used to have, where they would hang their name on it. So I you know, if you get me started on that, I'll go for hours. But I think that you know, you can reflect the banning of pornography to a certain cohort who, under 18 were probably the most experienced drivers of social media or, use of technology that around, is fraught with danger. It's just like the prohibition in America. It didn't work. It won't work. The conversation has to be around boundaries. The conversation has to be around empowerment of equality for all people. And I think that it can only be done from a groundswell point of view to make it an attractive thing for politicians to actually get behind, because they've gone out of the gate as far as policy is concerned. I get really passionate about that. If we could somehow, I think we did talk about it on Friday. This is a conversation that's never been had. And okay, I think there was 57 people on the start of this. Tomorrow you can have the conversation with another person. That's 114 people. And I think it's around that passion and adherence to that message of boundaries. Because, I've had men in groups go, hey, listen, what about BDSM? That's all right. They hurt each other. And then I'll just bring up, well, what are the systems that prop up a BDSM relationship? What are the safety mechanisms? And the whole group will start talking about, safe words, all this sort of stuff. You can easily have these conversations with men if you always focus on consent, equality, and, empowerment of each other. That's just my personal view.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Bianca. I'm going to move on to the next questioner. So I know Cheryl's had your hand up for quite some time, and Michael, I can see you have too. We've got 7 minutes left. So Cheryl, are you able to unmute yourself and talk to us?
Look, it's more of a comment and a contribution to the conversation more than anything. And I currently work in family safety practitioner work, and I've also done men's behaviour change. But a bulk of the last few years of my work, I've started doing respectful relationships, and that was doing confident kinder kids, and I was doing respectful relationships with grade 5 and 6 in primary schools, and I was repeating a more complex version with year 9 and 10 kids in high schools here in Shepparton. And it's really interesting because we started to look at the values and their attitudes towards sex, and what came across to me really clearly, particularly in the high school group, was they actually knew what their values were. These kids, they know kind of right and wrong, left from right. They're not entrenched yet in normalizing it. So at some point, the message is there, because when you lay all of the different scenarios on the floor, and I used to get them to rate them what was normal and what was okay and what was not okay, they pretty well got a lot of it right. And the girls felt empowered, and the boys said, oh no, I'd never do that. So there was this intrinsic value of knowing what's right and wrong. So at some point though, that gets lost in the barrage of the pornography. And I think this is where we have to come back and link, which is what this is about. What is the impact of pornography on what kids already are doing and knowing as right and wrong? Pornography is coming in and usurping those values. And I think that's the link that we've been trying to make today. And I've seen it in grade 5 and 6 kids. They know right from wrong. They say, oh, I'd never do that. So I think we've got to come back and link the whole notion of where pornography is hitting these 15 to 29-year-olds. And it's kind of watering down what their intrinsic values of right and wrong are.
Yeah, and I think it harks back to me of how does all of that link back to expectation, my expectation of you, my expectation of what I think you should be doing. Yeah. So that links really clearly back. So I might even have a set of values, or I might know, but I'm overriding that as an expectation of my own needs being fulfilled. Thank you for your input there. I'm just aware that Michael Riley's got a question. Luke, did you want to respond briefly to that?
Just really quickly, yeah, I noticed.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah,
really
thanks,
valuable.
Cheryl. It's and it's something that was similarly reflected. We did some work in Byron High quite a few years ago now, probably 3 or 4 years ago. And what I noticed was that the same thing, the year 9 and 10s that we were working with were able to speak really clearly about boundaries and respect and so on. What I did notice is every now and again there would be behaviours, even within that group, of gender inequality and disrespect. And it was like, wow, that's so interesting. They could talk to it better than any other group I'd ever heard. And yet it was still playing out. So the other piece that I'm interested in is how do we support that reflection and sort of tying you know, ideology, which they've clearly got, and they're really across it to like, did you see just what happened then? You know, like in terms of, without shaming, obviously, in a massive way, but how do we bring that in and work with that?
Yeah. How does it link into behaviour, which is, you know, clearly for us in our side of the working with men, we're very interested in those links. Michael, you have a question, and then I'm going to wrap it up. We've got a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Lizette, and thank you to the panel. Yeah, I'm primarily working in private practice now, but I was working and still do work with Relationships Australia and do some work with corrections in men's behaviour change. I was just wondering from the panel if you could share with us your experience of, and I'm hoping I haven't crossed over a little bit to what Kyalie might have discussed a little bit earlier about the co-leadership dynamics when the issue of pornography does come up in the room, particularly in the area of, and I've seen it happen both in the group when I've been facilitating and also when supervising, where it's trivialised. So it might just be a flippant comment that might come from one of the men, and about how we as a male-female co-leadership manage that trivialising or the minimising of, you know, a comment, or even a bit of laughter that might sort of pervade the room, because it can sort of creep in. And I think particularly for us as men, how we can allow a bit of collusion to occur between us and the men by the way we respond.
Okay, you've got a minute. Steve, go for it.
Okay, that comes back to, I think, I can't remember who said it, one of the panels said it, planning beforehand. You know, when we're going into that particular session, or that's going to come up, we have a lot of planning, because there's two really important things. There's the minimisation. If it's open minimisation, the male can go ahead and say, what's going on there for you? What is this? Why are we minimising this? What does that do for you? What does it do for the rest of the group? I think that if something's directed towards the woman, it's absolutely important that she holds that space and that she gets through that. Because if the male facilitator comes in, he's just going to reflect society as the rescuer, you know. So, yeah Michael, they're really tricky moments. And I think that looking at it from a really objective view, a lot of that stuff happens around nerves.
Yeah.
It's the reflection of the taboo. It's how do we get out of this bloody situation right now? So we've got to take all that into concern, I think.
Yeah.
And just to quickly, often the men in the male facilitator, in my experience, some men have sometimes stepped in and said, on behalf of Kyalie and myself, you know, a male COE has done that a few times, and I've had to actually say to him outside a group, never ever speak on behalf of me. I'll speak on behalf of myself. So if this is where you're sitting, then I need to establish where I'm sitting myself and not let you speak on behalf of me.
And even doing it in the group, I'm actually saying respectfully, I've got a voice. I think I have something to say here. Those people who have facilitated with me know that can happen for sure. I would just really like to thank the panelists for coming and having the courage and the self-reflection to come and have this conversation and to start the conversation we haven't had. We know that we're really keen to continue this conversation. I see it as we see it as a really cornerstone to the work. We know how much it's there, that's often not talked about. We're not supporting both the user of violence and the people who are being harmed to actually be able to talk about this stuff as well. So I really want to thank everybody. I want to thank all of you who've come. We've had, as someone said, about 50 odd people here today. So thanks so much for coming and joining in this conversation. Look out for the next session. We will be continuing this conversation with a bit more focus on consent. If anyone's really keen to sit on the panel or contribute to some way, just reach out to me and happy to have a conversation with you. We're really wanting to get people on board to be part of this national conversation. Thanks so much. Please take care of yourselves. This is may have been a triggering session for you. You may leave with a whole bunch of things rolling around inside you, or some things that have been triggered. Please go and have a cuppa, and if you need to speak to someone, have a breath of fresh air, and take care, everyone, while you're in lockdown. This is not an easy space to be in. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Kyalie, going to stay.